biological invasions and invasive alien species, or IAS, they're widely seen as this massive threat hitting biodiversity hard.
Definitely. And not just biodiversity, they mess with ecosystems, they can damage economies, even impact our health sometimes.
Right. So policymakers are trying to deal with this huge scale of risk. But how do we actually figure out which invaders need tackling now and which ones we can maybe just keep an eye on for a bit?
Yeah, that's the core question. And the answer really hinges on having good quality risk assessment, which actually brings us straight to our deep dive topic today.
Okay.
We're looking at a really important paper led by Helen E. Roy and a whole team of experts called Developing a Framework of Minimum Standards for the Risk Assessment of Alien Species. It was published in the Journal of Applied Ecology.
Ah, yes. I remember this one. So our mission today is basically to unpack how this huge international effort managed to sort of standardize risk assessment approaches globally. Because before this, it was a bit of a mess, wasn't it?
It really was a total patchwork. That's the problem the paper tackles head on. Historically, these risk assessments, RAs, they just varied wildly from place to place.
How so? Like different methods?
Completely different. You might have one country using a purely qualitative method, maybe just looking at environmental harm. Then next door, they might have a complex quantitative system focused on economic costs. This inconsistency, well, it caused massive problems for policy and coordination.
Right. So you could easily end up with a situation where one place says a species is low risk and somewhere else, maybe even nearby, has totally banned it.
Exactly that. And you can imagine that's a real headache for any kind of joined-up governance, especially across borders. These RAs, they're not just academic exercises, are they?
No, not at all.
They're the bedrock evidence for policy. They underpin legislation, they justify restrictions on trade, which is, super important if you want your rules to hold up under World Trade Organization, WTO, scrutiny.
Ah, okay. So it has real teeth, legally and economically.
Definitely. And it's also how we decide where to put our limited resources for things like surveillance or rapid response when something new arrives. When decisions have potentially big economic consequences, the science behind them has got to be consistent and, frankly, legally defensible.
Okay, let's dig into how they actually did this then. Because getting global agreement on what makes a good risk assessment, when you've got systems covering everything from tiny marine organisms to massive forest trees, different climates, different continents, it sounds like a recipe for endless arguments.
It could have been. It really needed a structured, step-by-step approach to get everyone on the same page, moving beyond just regional preferences. They kicked off with a huge literature review,
Right.
gathered about 70 publications describing original RA methods. Then they filtered that right down to 29 distinct schemes that were sort of broad enough to potentially apply across different regions or types of species.
Okay, so they basically collected all the existing best practice examples.
Mhm.
What was the next step? How did they meld those 29 into one single framework?
Well, the clever bit was they didn't just compare them to each other. They cross-referenced them against the big international agreements, stuff like the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, the International Plant Protection Convention, IPPC.
Okay, the high-level stuff.
Yeah, and crucially also against the EU regulation on IAS that's 1143/2014, which is known for being pretty stringent. That whole process ensured the final framework wouldn't just be scientifically sound, but also legally robust and relevant pretty much everywhere.
And then came the workshop, right? In Brussels. 35 experts, 17 countries. That sounds like where the real heavy lifting happened.
That was the key moment, absolutely. That's where the real consensus building took place. You had everyone in the room, ecologists, policy people, economists, practitioners,
Wow.
covering all the angles, marine, freshwater, terrestrial, all non-microbial life forms. And they didn't just chat, they used structured methods like ranking and voting.
To force agreement, essentially.
Well, to distill it down, to figure out what were the absolute must-have components for any RA to be considered good quality. That rigorous process is why the final 14 minimum standards are seen as so transparent and objective.
That's genuinely impressive, getting that range of experts to agree on specifics. Okay, so let's get into the findings. The 14 standards, this is the practical checklist, right? You mentioned we can group them.
Yeah, exactly. It makes them easier to grasp. The first group really focuses on the basics, understanding the species itself and how likely it is to invade. Okay, so standard 1, just describing the species, its taxonomy, where it's from, where it's invaded before. But hang on, it also says you need to outline potential socioeconomic benefits. That seems counterintuitive for a risk assessment. Why look at the positives? Well, it's about being balanced and objective from the start. Even if the final conclusion is high risk, the assessment process itself has to acknowledge the full context. It doesn't mean you weigh benefits against risks in the final score, but you have to show you considered them.
Got it. Okay. Then standard 2 gets into the core invasion process.
Right. Likelihood of introduction, establishment, spread, and crucially, the potential magnitude of impact. What's the scale we're likely dealing with?
And standard 4 jumps to how it gets here. The pathways, that seems vital for actually stopping things.
Absolutely critical for management. Standard 4 demands a proper look at introduction pathways and vectors, both intentional, like trading plants,
Well, that's, yeah.
or pets, exactly, and unintentional things like organisms hitching a ride and ship ballast water or hiding in packing materials. You need that info because often the most effective and cheapest way to prevent new invasions is to manage those pathways.
Okay, that makes sense. Then we shift gear to the impacts themselves. Standard 5 talks about biodiversity and ecosystem effects, more than just counting species lost.
Much more. It means looking deeper. Are there genetic impacts? Is it changing nutrient cycles? Is it messing up the food web? It's about the whole system's health.
Right. And Standard 8 adds another layer, something about endangered species.
Yeah, it basically says you have to consider the status of the native species or habitats being threatened. So if the invader is moving into an area with species already on the IUCN Red List, critically endangered, vulnerable.
Then the impact is automatically rated as more severe.
Exactly, because those systems or species just don't have the resilience to cope as well.
Okay, now this is interesting. The paper highlighted areas where existing RAs were often weak. You mentioned Standard 6, 7, and 9 were particularly novel or challenging.
Yes, these three really push assessors beyond traditional ecology. Standard 6 is about adverse impacts on ecosystem services.
Can you quickly remind us what ecosystem services covers? It's a term we hear a lot.
Sure, it's basically all the practical benefits humans get from nature, often for free. Things like clean water filtered by wetlands, carbon storage by forests, pollination by insects, timber, places for recreation.
Okay, the functional benefits. Precisely. The assessment needs to ask, how is this invasive species disrupting those specific functions? Now, the paper admits this is tough. The hard data, the empirical evidence, is often really thin on the ground. So how do you assess it then?
Well, they recommend using established frameworks like CICS, that's the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services, to structure the thinking, even if the assessment ends up being more descriptive initially due to data gaps.
Okay, and Standard 7. That sounds more direct socioeconomic impacts.
Yes, direct human consequences. Things like damage to agriculture, fisheries, forestry, impacts on human health, maybe the invader is a disease vector, or even effects on cultural values or recreation.
And this needs proper assessment too.
Absolutely. And again, there's a push towards using standardized methods. The paper mentions CICAT, the Socioeconomic Impact Classification of Alien Taxa, which is a tool designed to help measure these impacts in a consistent way globally. Makes comparisons easier. And the last one of this group, Standard 9, this one feels very forward-looking, factoring in future climate change.
It's crucial, isn't it? RAs can't just be a snapshot of now. We know climate change is likely to help many invasive species.
How so?
Well, rising temperatures might create suitable conditions for longer periods, allowing them to establish or spread faster. Or changing weather patterns like more extreme events could even help transport them. Think about floodwaters moving seeds, for example. So the RA needs to consider these predictable future changes. It makes the whole assessment much more useful for long-term planning.
Okay, so we've covered the species, the invasion process, the impacts, ecological, ecosystem services, socioeconomic, and future climate effects. But you mentioned earlier that for these things to stand up, especially in trade disputes or policy debates, the process itself needs to be rock solid. Exactly. That takes us to the next group of standards, the procedural ones. These are all about rigor, transparency, documentation. This is what gives the framework its real strength, legally and scientifically. Let's tackle a big one. Missing data. Standard 10 says you still have to do the assessment even if information is limited. That sounds risky. How do you avoid just guessing? That's a fair challenge. But it's not about guesswork because it's tightly linked to Standard 13, which is all about uncertainty.
Okay, explain that link.
Standard 10 says yes, proceed even with gaps, using a precautionary approach if needed, but Standard 13 forces the assessor to state, for every single conclusion, what the confidence level is.
How do they judge confidence? It's based on two things. the amount and quality of the available evidence, and the level of agreement among the experts involved. So if you have very little data and rely heavily on expert opinion, you must state that the confidence level is low.
Ah, I see. So it's transparent. It stops people pretending weak data is strong evidence. Precisely. It manages expectations and ensures honesty about the limits of current knowledge. That transparency is absolutely key.
And documentation plays into that transparency too, I imagine.
Completely. Standard 11 insists that all information sources are properly cited, whether it's peer-reviewed science, government reports, gray literature, or even documented expert opinion. Traceability is vital.
Okay. And once all that work is done, how is it presented?
That's Standard 12. The final summary has to be consistent and easy for decision makers to understand. No dense academic jargon. Typically, it's a clear scale like low, medium, high risk, with very clear guidelines on how to interpret that rating.
And the final check, Standard 14.
Quality assurance. Basically, the whole RA report needs to be reviewed either through formal peer review or by an independent expert panel to make sure it's actually fit for purpose before it gets used to make those big policy calls. It's a final quality control step.
So thinking about the real-world impact then, this framework wasn't just a theoretical exercise, was it? Has it actually changed how things are done?
Oh, definitely. Its major implication is that it provides this single, globally applicable benchmark, a robust, repeatable way to make evidence-based decisions. And we've seen existing, quite sophisticated schemes like the GB non-native risk assessment used here in the UK, or Harmonia plus New, which is used across Europe, actually being updated and modified specifically to make sure they fully meet these 14 minimum standards.
So it's proven practical, it works on the ground.
It does. It shows the checklist approach can be integrated into complex existing systems.
But no system is perfect. What did the authors flag as the biggest ongoing challenge or limitation? They were very upfront about it. The single greatest practical constraint remains the lack of solid empirical evidence for many species, especially when they're newly arrived. The data gap problem again.
Exactly. You can have the best standards in the world, but if the data just isn't there yet, you inevitably have to rely more on expert judgment, which is precisely why those transparency standards, 10 on proceeding with caution and 13 on stating uncertainty, are so incredibly important. They provide the safety net when evidence is thin.
Looking ahead then, did this whole consensus process point towards specific areas where we need more research?
Yes, strongly. It really highlighted the need for more genuinely interdisciplinary work, particularly in getting better, more standardized ways to assess those tricky impacts on ecosystem services and properly quantifying the socioeconomic consequences.
So developing tools like that SACAP method you mentioned earlier becomes even more critical.
Absolutely. Making those parts of the risk assessment as robust and evidence-based as the purely ecological parts is a major goal for the future.
Well, this has been fascinating. It really shows how crucial developing these high-quality, consistent standards is. It's the foundation needed for effective global policy, moving the conversation from just worrying about what might happen to demanding evidence for what is likely to happen. It really does shift the baseline. And perhaps here's a final thought for you to chew on. The success of this framework, this harmonization, really depends on it not being static. It needs regular review and revision. Why is that so critical?
Well, think about climate change again. We know many invasive species are likely to benefit maybe through longer growing seasons or increased transport due to extreme weather events. The challenge isn't just assessing today's risks accurately. It's about predicting and preparing for the risks of tomorrow. So, how often do we need to reevaluate species currently deemed low risk? And what new tools or data will we need to keep this whole assessment process ahead of the curve, especially with potentially rapid environmental changes? That's the ongoing question.
A really important point about keeping science dynamic and responsive. How do we future-proof our conservation efforts? Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.